Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here with what should be a mostly quick and dirty sound check of my DeLisle Amp-Speaker Selector V4 Deluxe. Though, just like with some of the other products in this category, I think it's accurate to say we're also checking for a lack of sound, as transparency is a bit of the name of the game, but this will also open you up to a whole new world of soundscapes should you have the gear to complement it, as we'll investigate in this video. So I've had this for about two and a half years now, and besides some standalone videos like maybe the Tone Engineer or a couple other series where I'm dedicating an entire video to a single amplifier and cabinet combination, there's almost a guaranteed chance that if it involved any of these amps or any of the other cabinets you see, this was also involved in the video production, and it has made life exponentially more simple, not only for the video production and music production in general, but just being inspired to play through real tube amplifiers, because it takes out not only stress, but the hassle of having to reconfigure different combinations of amp heads and cabinets. Now, for most sane and rational guitar players out there, this entire class of gear is totally unnecessary. You might have a digital multi-effects unit and a combo amplifier, or maybe even a couple of stacks and fixed configurations that you go back and forth between. And if you want to change your sound, then you unplug your guitar or even pedal board out of the front of one amp and into the other one, and ta-da, you're done. But for someone as obsessive as I am, who likes to have multiple flavors of distortion textures and all kinds of speaker and cabinet combinations, and want to mix and match those constantly for different demonstrations or just jamming out loud in the room, then it becomes an absolute nightmare to switch between those different sounds on the fly, and can actually pose a danger to the amplifier itself should you make a mistake. And up until about two and a half years ago, my process was very much prone to those sort of mistakes, as if I wanted to record a video that featured multiple amplifiers through one cabinet, or one amplifier through multiple cabinets, or multiple amps through multiple cabinets, it was a long, arduous game of record what I wanted to, turn off that amplifier, go behind the back of the amps, dig through the black spaghetti, find the input outputs, now, go over to this cabinet, fire that amplifier up, wait a little bit. Okay, now you get the mic in, there's your two passes you needed for that thing, start all over again. It was even worse in the context of trying out new pedals, as I would usually dial in a couple of tones with one head and then want to switch over to another one to see how that pedal would react there. But by the time I would finish rewiring and moving heads around and doing some rough cable management so it didn't look completely disgusting, I'd mostly lost the motivation to play guitar in the first place. And by the time I acquired about amp head number 5 2 years ago, I said, this is enough. We have to do something here. Now, I've been keeping an eye on the amp switch market for some time, and there's plenty of competitors out there and plenty of companies that beat DeLisle to the punch in terms of getting a product set out there. And Pete is probably one of the most well-known ones. Cayenne, I believe that's how you say it. And I remember KHE in particular making some waves a few years ago on YouTube with some of their more compact options. But all those companies offer different configurations, whether it be effects loop switching or this amount of amps versus this amount of cabinets and vice versa, or even some different MIDI control options where you could remote switch from a DAW in the studio or even on stage, or if you wanted to tie it in with a MIDI controller, and anytime you change your pedal board loops, it changes your amp and cab configuration. Those things are an option. For me, I did not need all those bells and whistles. For the things that I'm using, I would at most be switching channels over MIDI with a single amp. I don't really have the need to ever go between two amps in that way, but I just wanted to have some simple on-the-fly option that I could do with either a foot switch or a simple turn of a knob and not lose an arm and a leg in the process. Enter DeLisle and their absolutely insane range of amplifier and cabinet switches. At the time that I purchased this, and another product we'll show shortly, I only saw about half a dozen to 10 options, and there was still covering a lot of ground that most of the market did not. For a lot of those aforementioned brands, you had 2, maybe 3 options each, ranging from kind of bare bones and not exactly what you want, but then on the higher end for someone like me, it was way overkill. At that time, they had, something that was more compact. It could do like a 1x3 or 3x1 option. They had this one, of course, and some that were a bit larger. They could do something like 8x8 or maybe 4x4 with effects loop switching and some other options. Great offerings as is. Now, though, they have an entire web page full of wacky options that goes from 8x8 selectors that will run each amp and cabinet simultaneously. Some of them will have the same amp be able to go through multiple cabinets. On some switches, there's a 20 amp by 1 cab option. There's a 4 rack preamp through 4 rack power amp selector. Basically, any problem you can think of where you would want to kind of have different levels of mixing and matching on some input going into some output in a guitar amp application, they probably have something to fit the need. And I get the feeling, based on my correspondence with them, that they're kind of on a smaller side where they can be agile and come up with different designs on the fly like this. And I think that's great, even if the volumes aren't huge. I'm really glad that someone like that exists to cover this stuff. They also make amplifiers and pedals and cabinets and stuff that I've never had the chance to try myself. They sounded good. I'd be interested in trying more of their stuff, though, especially after spending time with this guy. So for those of you that aren't exactly familiar with what these do and the function behind them, basically you have multiple amplifier loops, you could call them, and speaker outputs. The single input can take whatever you want to plug in there in an instrument level, whether it be your guitar directly or a reamp signal coming from your PC, or that aforementioned use case where you're running a pedal board in front, whatever you want to do, that will go directly to whichever amplifier you have selected. Now, coming from the switch will be another instrument cable. So like amplifier number 1, for this case, goes to the cherry tone gargoyle, and then out from the speaker output section, that goes back into the switch. So loop in, loop out. Of course, you got a instrument signal going in and a speaker signal coming out. That will then go to whichever speaker you have selected with another speaker cable. So in this instance, speaker number 3 would be the oversized Recto cab behind me, 2 would be this Jet City cab, 4 would be the Marshall cabinet, so on and so forth. Now, at this point, we've essentially replaced the actions of unplugging and plugging back in speaker and instrument cables with this, which is already a huge improvement, don't get me wrong, but that's not enough in terms of the amplifier switching, because as I was mentioning earlier, tube amplifiers need some kind of load when they're powered on. Now, for tonality and accuracy, of course, I champion reactive loads, and that's what really gets the essence of a speaker impedance correct. But for just sitting idle, it doesn't really care. If it has 8 ohms going to its 8 ohm speaker tap, it's going to be happy. So anytime you switch off of one amplifier onto another one, say if I go from amplifier 1 to amplifier 2, my gargoyle has now been put on a dummy load. Not only is there no active signal being sent to any of the other 3 amplifiers that you don't have selected, but their output transformers are satisfied by dummy loads within these switches themselves. And that is huge because you can keep every one of them powered on basically all the time whenever you're playing, and whenever you get the mood to change sounds, boom, you got another amp. So for today's demonstration, number 1's my gargoyle, rectifier, number 3 is the Mark series, so on and so forth. And of course, do the same thing with the speaker cabinet, giving you effectively 16 combinations of sounds with this one switch. Now, there is one small caveat with this design in particular, and I think some of the digitally controlled versions of other companies' switches don't necessarily have this exact same problem, but DeLisle's manual says not to be playing any active chords or sounds while you're making the switch between amplifiers and cabinets. I imagine it's because there's going to be that fraction of a second where that switch is open and the signal is being directed to nowhere. It's coming off of one contact, going to another one, and you don't want to be putting any stress on the amplifiers during that time. So during my demonstrations of this, you're going to hear a slight pause where I'll mute the signal, stop playing, then make the switch, go back and forth. But boy, is that still better, way better than having to physically unplug and plug cables back in. And just look how much nicer everything looks because of that. We'll talk about these other 2 toggle switches here in a moment, but one great aspect of the DeLisle stuff that you'll see in this demonstration is that in loop 4, I actually have a solid state amp. So the GT1000 Effects neutral power amp that I'm using to plug basically whatever direct signal I want into here. If I want to play a fractal audio device. I can pipe it into that without cabinet emulation. For today's demonstration, we'll have some DI profiles on the Kemper. Again, no cabinet emulation, and there's nothing stopping you from turning on all the effects and putting virtual drive pedals or real drive pedals up front if you wanted to. So this is a great way to experience digital platforms through speaker and cabinet sounds that you're familiar with, because it can kind of eliminate that variable and gives you a more lively feel should you be craving that. One feature you'll probably see on just about all of DeLisle's amp speaker selectors is this ground switch. And if I recall correctly, I don't think I needed to use it on any of the demonstrations I recorded for this video. But if you ever do get some ground loop noise or something that just sounds weird once you plug a pedal up front, or I know I've had it occasionally with like my Cherrytone, not so much on the Mesa stuff, but um, just some oddball times where using like the rack boss stuff, or maybe a pedal that uses a different power polarity on its power supply, you might get some weird hissing or kind of a strange noise feedback. 4 out of 5 times, that usually fixes it. Now, I do try to keep all of my gear, whether we're talking about my recording interface or everything being piped into here, all on one circuit in the house. That may be impossible depending on your circumstances, but all of my amplifiers are going to the same Furman. Every switch, everything's going to the same circuit. So generally I don't run into those issues, but on the rare occasion that I do, that tends to solve that problem immediately. The more useful feature most of the time for me is the attenuator switch. Now, they have some pro models that actually include a reactive attenuator in the switch itself, which is pretty great. Were that available at that time, I would definitely go a different route, and I would very much like to hear it to compare to what it sounds like to the hot plate, because if that could save some rack space and everything, I'd be more than down for that. For my current use case though, activating this switch inserts the THD hot plate between the amp output and speaker input, where I have anywhere from -4 to -infinity decibels of attenuation, with some bright and deep switches for low and high resonances should Mr. Fletcher or Mr. Munson start becoming problematic at lower volumes. For me, most of the time, especially with these amplifiers, I don't generally need it, even for recording volumes. I've got pads and stuff on the preamps that I use for microphones, and most of the time I keep master volumes at a level that is just not an issue. But if you're someone who's relying on the big power amp sounds of a non-master volume amp, or you're really pushing the master volume hard for power amp breakup, which I do from time to time on the Mesa Mark IV Clean and Crunch channel. And if you do that, I would definitely recommend you have a switch with an attenuator loop in it, because it's another one of those things where, yeah, it costs a little more up front, it's a little more headroom and things you got to account for, especially cabling, but actually does save you in the long run, not only in the headache of wiring the stuff up, but now I have instant access to this with every amp, and I don't need 4 of them. This last section covers a rabbit hole that I do not recommend you go down, but it is an option and it's one I'm taking advantage of right now. And you might be in a similar boat where maybe you barely exceed the capabilities of what one of the 600-ish dollar switches can do. Maybe you have a 5 amp by 4 speaker cab configuration, or in my case, like a 4 by 6 configuration, and it doesn't make sense to pony up almost double or over double and give up another U of rack space for something that's going to only accommodate 1 or 2 more amps for you. Because here's what's going to happen. If I get an 8x8 at some point, I'm going to fill the damn thing because that's the way I am. So for me, I'm pretty good on the amplifier side of things. Yeah, it'd be nice to have a couple more spaces every now and again, but for anytime I'm borrowing amplifiers or if I need to do something really quickly, it's not too hard to get to number 2. On the speaker cab side, though, if you count everything up in the room, I actually have 6 speaker options. So there's 5 different cabinets and then the SUR reactive load. The SUR is taking up speaker spot number 1. Now, had I known ahead of time that I would have a reactive load eventually with a DI output, I might have planned around this a little differently, but that sounds so good, I don't think I would have done anything differently. So got the direct option. Cab 2, of course, is this. Cab 3 is this. Cab 4, I was a little misleading before because there's not just one Cab 4. There's 3 Cab 4s, 4-1, 4-2 out of frame, and even farther out of frame, 4-3, with the Mesa Teal cabinet and the Randall 4x12 respectively. I'm accomplishing this by daisy chaining the 4th speaker output from the V4 into the input of a V1, which is sitting on top of my SUR reactive load. And this is kind of their entry-level, smaller form factor switch where you can route 3 amps into 1 cabinet, of course 1 at a time, or 1 amp into 3 cabinets. Every single input or output acts as an input or output, and they're all load protected. So that's a great little device. And realistically, I think it's more common that most people will have 1 or 2 amps in a cabinet or vice versa versus the craziness that I'm doing. But I told them what I was going to do with it, and they actually offered to modify it, take out the resistive loads, and give me a little bit of a discount for it. I'm sure they still made plenty of money on that, but it works flawlessly for me. It's been a great little addition to get everything onto 3 switches, which I'm fine with. And if I really wanted to, I could absolutely do the same thing on the amplifier side by having a 4-1, 2, and 3 sub-select switch with another V1. Just haven't gotten to that point, and there's going to come a time where if I expanded that level, it's going to make more sense to ditch this and get a bigger switch. But as of right now, I'm really, really happy with this setup. And though I definitely don't sit here every day and go, woo, you know, amp 1, cab 4, speaker 2, amplifier 3, you know, like a madman. When I do want to go back and forth, it's just thoughtless. It's just, oh, there you go. Okay, I've had my fun there. Over here, and it's just one less thing to have to worry about making videos, and it makes playing the stuff I already own that much better. And that will conclude today's sound check. I can't exactly put the Amp-Speaker Selector V4 on a list of shit you need because I really doubt it. I highly doubt most of you watching this would even need the V1 for a 3x1 capability. But I gotta say, for the 600 and change dollars I paid for this thing, even though it cost almost as much as some of the tube heads here, and actually more than some of the solid state stuff. It's hardly a fair comparison. I can definitely say this is one of the best guitar accessories I've ever bought. And it doesn't even make a sound, right? Again, it's one of those things where it's not supposed to, but it just brings out the full potential of the stuff that you already own. And I find that when you already are starting with something that's so great, when you have a great amp platform or a good cabinet, being able to just use the damn thing easily and coaxing all the tones out of it that you can, that's worth its weight in gold to me. And this is one of those products. For a single amp use case, I think a reactive load is still probably the absolute best thing you can buy. But if you've got a wall of amplifiers and cabinets and you have no way of being able to quickly change between them, or especially mix and match cabs and amplifier head configurations, get one of these. Just, it doesn't even matter who you go with. I can absolutely throw my hat in the ring for DeLisle, but if you need more advanced loop switching or maybe MIDI control, then yeah, feel free to look at some of the competition. They've basically all made a name for themselves at this point as well, but absolutely love this thing. I will never go a day without having some sort of tube amp and speaker switch of some kind. And if I can help it, it'll probably be another DeLisle product should I need something else later down the road. So yeah, whether you know it or not, this is probably in the videos you're watching and hearing if it has to do with a real amplifier or speaker cabinet. So just wanted to give a shout out to one of the unsung heroes on this channel when it comes to my gear collection. So as always, thank you so very much for watching. If you have any other questions or comments, please leave those down below, and we will see you next time. Bye.